Welcome to this episode of the Psychedelic Mom Podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Carlin, and I'm here today with Jen Bruce. How are you?
I'm so good. Thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, good to see you.
You too.
Jen, you're a functional nutritionalist, a lifestyle practitioner, psychedelic integration specialist, Kundalini yoga teacher, and a coach and founding member of Decriminalized Nature in Arcata, California. Mm-hmm. Did you just say one of 3 states that have had a grassroots effort to decriminalize entheogens?
No, there's been decriminalized nature passed in some states now, Colorado, all over, but we are one of 3 cities in California that have decriminalized entheogens through grassroots movement. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And you specialize in a holistic approach to addiction, trauma, mental health recovery, and you've been on your own recovery path for 13 years, and you are a mother of a daughter?
I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, love to welcome other psychedelic moms who are aligning with plant medicines to become better mothers. So welcome here today.
It's nice to be with my people.
Yeah. So you have quite a story. You had an addiction to alcohol that was really difficult. I'd love to hear your story, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with us, and what that was like, and how you went from alcohol addiction to recovery to, at some point, plant medicines and that journey, and now to working in the healing arts.
Yeah. So a lot happened along the way. I can now say in my 13th year of recovery that my addiction is the best thing that ever happened to me, but it did not feel like that while I was going through it. By the end of it, addiction happens in stages, but by the end of it, I think that it was, one of the most painful experiences that a human being can go through. And it's not to diminish, the horrific things that are happening in the world that people don't have a choice over, but addiction, you don't really have a choice. There is no choice in addiction either. And so, very much now I can look back and see the dark night of the soul. I can see Joseph Campbell's work in The Hero's Journey. I've chosen to reframe my experience as that, and it works for me. But I came from a long line of alcoholics and Irish and veterans, that were back then, they didn't have any kind of treatment for PTSD, mental health problems, very, very typical family lineage. And so, by the time I grew up, I was a straight A student. I had top grades in my entire school district. I was a competitive figure skater and a violinist. And, I quit figure skating, I think 13, and without that structure, I look back now and I always joke that my first recovery program was figure skating because of all of the elements there. But by the time I was 14, I'd taken my first drink, and because of the, I now realize the personal and generational trauma that I carried, my genetics and the environment that I was raised in, that I was, primed to become addicted to alcohol. So at the beginning of my addiction, it was very fun. I had really strong social anxiety since I was a young child. I took my first drink and it took that away, and I could connect with people. So I started drinking because it enabled me to relax, be myself, and meaningfully connect with other people. But I was off to the races pretty quick. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon. So back then in the 90s, the Grateful Dead element was still really huge. Jerry Garcia played at my high school in the cafeteria. One of my first jobs was working for Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters at their 5-day-long LSD parties. So that was the second wave. And there was a lot of beauty there, but then there was also a lot of darkness. And because of my personal constellation, I was at really high risk for addiction. But, the addiction always starts out with some mostly fun and some problems. Then it goes into fun and problems, and by the end, it's just problems. And so that's a pretty generalized way to describe a very long and crazy and just crazy journey through the dark night of the soul that addiction will take you through. And I'm just so grateful to be alive because, most people don't get to the other side of this and find the wisdom that kind of an experience can provide in one's life.
So you were 14 when you started drinking, and it sounded like you left home really young. Did you leave home at 14 years old?
Yeah. I love my mother dearly. She was a single mother, working full time back in the 80s, just, a daughter of a military family. And so she struggled with severe depression as a result of her own trauma. And so I left my home at 14 to go on Grateful Dead tour, and I haven't lived at home since. I'm 43 now. And, from age 20 to 30, I was in pretty severe alcoholism, and then also other addictions to substances, but the alcohol was what really took me to my knees. And so from 20 to 30, I was a blackout drinker for 10 years.
When was the time where you were working the concert scene?
I was back in that scene from 1994 till early 2000s. And then I ended up in Humboldt.
What was that like?
It was beautiful because back then, it was like this band of gypsies. The first time I went to India, I saw all the sadhus, and not to diminish the ancient sacred nature of what the sadhus are, the renunciate yogis in India. But I was kind of like, the Grateful Dead and festival scene was kind of like a combination of sadhu and gypsy, and the rainbow gatherings and the raves where the first time we saw the MDMA coming into the country, and, a lot of beauty, but also a lot of darkness, right? Like that's not a medicinal setting. I think that early use of psychedelics probably helped to save my life through the addiction. Because once I got into my 20s, I laid the psychedelics down. I started drinking more, and then things like pharmaceuticals and cocaine came in, and that just brought the darkness in. But I had those seeds planted from the entheogenic experiences I had prior to that, and I think that it did really help me navigate that walk between life and death that all of us who have experienced addiction have to go through at some point or another.
At what point do you think you knew you had a problem?
I think from the very beginning, because it was like after I started drinking, it's like I my other kids at high school will drink on the weekends and party, but then they go back home and they go back to school and they go back to football training. And I decided it was a much better fit for me to go on Grateful Dead tour and never stop partying. So
how safe was that as a 14-year-old to be away from home and have no care providers? What was that like?
It was dangerous and exciting. It was the first time that I'd really think I found a sense of community, because I was probably one of the youngest ones, but the age range was 16 to 22. And, there was an economy. We learned how to support each other, and we stuck together, and so there was that. But it's dangerous out there. And Grateful Dead in the 90s was not all rainbows and butterflies. It was, there's drug dealing and there was heroin, tons of heroin, and all kinds of things were going on, and when people get arrested a lot on Grateful Dead tour. And I remember people on the East Coast, if the kids that were touring around, because there's all different demographics that would come to these shows. This was the kids on tour is what they were called. They were the diehard, just this is our world. And so if one of those kids would get arrested, and had a Grateful Dead tattoo, they'd actually get housed in the gang unit. So it wasn't this Haight-Ashbury thing. It had gotten darker because the heroin and the crack cocaine had come in and stuff like that too.
So walk me through the dark night of the soul that you experienced through your addiction. What that's like. Yeah. How bad does it get for someone who has an addiction?
Well, it depends, right? There's a myth about bottom, and I'll get to that in a minute. But so, typically for anybody with addiction, this was my story, was that if you I can look back now and see that I was hooked on my first drink because it helped me see that the addiction's not the problem, it's the solution to the problem. You'll hear people like Dr. Gabor Mate speaking to this a lot these days. Underneath addiction, there's always trauma. And it usually gets misdiagnosed as mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, ADD, ADHD, these kinds of things. But there's this inability to ultimately find a sense of safety within our own body. And we can get into all the biology of that's why I work with nutrition, because a lot of it's in the body, somatics. And then, it's very natural, especially if you have the genetics to pair with this, to reach for something to uplift you in the dopamine pathway, the reward system in the brain. Ultimately, addiction is highly linked on a physiological level to dopamine deficiency. And when you don't have enough dopamine, there's no reward. That's the chemical we need to get a sense of reward and satisfaction out of life. And human beings need that so badly that if you don't have enough, you will reach out and almost kill yourself sometimes trying to feel better, right? So that's what it starts like, and you feel better. And then as you go along, that medicine, whatever you're addicted to, starts to lessen in its ability to soothe your symptoms, because there's an element of tolerance that's developed, and that's a required aspect of diagnosing an addiction, is have I gained a tolerance over time. So and this is the same with anything we're using to just mask symptoms, so this could be applied to the whole Western medical model. We're not getting to the root, we're covering it up, and so those roots are getting bigger and deeper and stronger. So that gets louder than the substance can bring down. And so you start using more and more. Another hallmark of addiction is, because some people just have a problem with alcohol, and then there's the real addiction. And you'll hear this talk in 12-step a lot, the real alcoholic. I don't really like that word, but, just for sake of people understanding what I'm talking about. And then there's the problem. So you get to the point where the problems become great enough, and then you stop. You may even need medical assistance, but you stop and you can go on with your life. Now, for the person that's truly addicted, what you do is you start lowering your standards in life. You start hanging out with people that you wouldn't have hung out before. You start letting your dreams and aspirations go. And, by the time you're so deep into it, you don't even realize, and it's too late. But, at the end of my last few years of my drinking, I had to drink vodka in the morning to stop shaking. If I didn't, I would go into DTs, or I would start to get seizures. And even then, it's not enough. You'll still keep drinking. So, by the end.
Is that terrifying?
It's not really when you're in it, because you get into this place where you see everything the wrong way. It's almost like you're seeing a mirror reflection of reality. So it's exactly opposite. You think life is so hard that you have to drink to survive. Or to manage. And this doesn't have to be such a low bottom case. I would be considered pretty low bottom. So you could be feeling guilty that you can't get through your kid's birthday party without 3 glasses of wine, and that can be your bottom. It doesn't matter. So just because this story, I want to say, don't be oh, I'm not as bad as her, so I don't need to quit yet. This doesn't start this way, it ends this way. And every single time, it never gets better. So,
So that, I want to go back for 1 second, just so I understand. You were talking about the dopamine and the need for that dopamine and the hunger that gets so insatiable. Is part of the problem the alcohol is actually depleting the dopamine because of the sugar in the alcohol or other drugs? Or what is the original kind of dopamine issue?
Yeah, so when I refer to dopamine in addiction, dopamine is the end result of the entire reward pathway in the brain, and that includes serotonin, GABA, your endorphins, which are your natural opiates, and then these work in a chorus to then drop out dopamine at the end. So typically for people that have addiction tendencies, and it can be behaviors, it can be substances, it can be anything, but it's things that stimulate that next hit. And the interesting thing is, in the genetic side of these things, is that we now know there's 12 genes associated with addiction along the dopamine pathway. And the main gene is the DRD2 gene for alcoholism specifically, and that's the hunter-gatherer gene. It's the warrior gene. So this gene used to serve us, would have made us a leader in our tribe back when we were living in our traditional setting of hunter-gatherer. Because in order to get that next dopamine hit, what do we have to do? We have to go out and hunt. We have to gather firewood. We have to forage for mushrooms. We have to be ready to fight the warring tribe. And we're hypersensitized to danger and stress because we are designed to be looking around for wild animals or anything that may be a danger to our village to protect our people. So it was a attribute. Now fast forward in today's world. So what makes that happen is that people that are wired this way tend to metabolize dopamine faster, just like some people have a faster physical metabolism. And so fast forward in today's world, we're not living in that environment anymore. Where do we get our next hit? We get our next hit from booze, from drugs, from inappropriate sex, pornography, shopping, screen time, social media, all kinds of stuff. And then, but you look at alcoholism or, alcohol use disorder specifically, the only medicinal use for alcohol is to sterilize microorganisms, right? So inside of our digestive tract, there is between 5 and 7 pounds of bacteria that, when in healthy balance, serves some of the most important roles in our entire body. One of them being is the manufacturing and the use of serotonin. So you think about it, if you're drinking for years, you're constantly killing your microbiome off, pathogens come in, your body's essentially lost its ability to create its own serotonin. Depression and alcohol use disorder is highly linked. The other neurotransmitter that's produced in that same environment is GABA, which is our natural Xanax. 60% of our GABA comes from that microbiome as well. And so if we've killed off the microbiome, we've killed off our natural Xanax, what's going to happen? We're going to have a lot more anxiety. There's more to it than that, but there's a lot of physiology involved, so
So if you go back and you think of that time when you're drinking vodka first thing in the morning with your breakfast, what were the losses at that point of your life? What had you kind of experienced as far as your friends, your family?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I lost my friendships. I lost the ability to make healthy. I had a lot of friends, but not healthy friendships, not healthy community at all, because when you're at that level, you have to be hanging out with people at that level, or you will choose people that are even worse so that you can feel better about where you're at. I had lost my building block years. Most people are getting their life structured out in their 20s. I completely let that go. And, I had distanced myself from my family. So the greatest pain, and what finally brought me into choosing recovery, it wasn't, people talk badly about you. There's so much stigma with women alcoholics, especially with women, and people don't understand it because not everybody has a problem with that. Why doesn't she just stop? All of these things, but that wasn't enough. It's like realizing that, because inside, such a good person we all are, I cared. I wanted to do good work in the world. I wanted to be a good friend. And, I could see that my beautiful self deep down there inside somewhere, but it had been lost. And I would cry, like there was a few friends around, and I would cry and I'd be like, nobody understands me. And I'm not this way, but when you're blacked out, you do things and stuff. And so he said, well, Jen, that may be the case, but that's not what you become. And I really, wow. And so the pain was my inability to be my authentic, amazing self in the world, and my behavioral patterns that were driven by my alcohol use disorder had created this whole persona of not the kind of person anybody would probably want to be hanging around with. And that's what was creating my life. So it's like, you'll hear people with addiction say that they feel like their life is going on somewhere else. That's you're so off your soul's path that there's this incredible pain, but it's also a yearning that can serve you, because if there's pain, it means there's love, and that there's a yearning for something that is missing,
So what was the turning point? You had mentioned you had an experience one night.
Mm-hmm.
that kind of was an opening to something different. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I'd quit drinking and drugs for 6 months, white knuckle, no recovery program, nothing. That was miserable. I do not recommend that. I was living in the actual problem without my medicine or solution, which was the alcohol and the drugs. My friends came over one night. It was New Year's Eve, 2010 to 2011, and they brought a bottle of whiskey and some MDMA. And we went out for a little while. Nothing really bad happened. We got back to my house. They went to sleep, but I was the one who stayed up and drank the whiskey all night long. And I started doing the MDMA in amounts like you would do rails of cocaine, because that's how I used to abuse, that's when it's a club drug. But that night I was just so heartbroken to feel that my life was going on somewhere else and I couldn't find it. And because of the MDMA, even though I was not using it in a therapeutic setting, and I wouldn't recommend this, but it was just, we call them God shots in recovery. Like, it was just my time. And so I had a vision of a Ganesha, Mother Mary type figure, so beautiful. And she came across to me and told me that it was I'd paid my debt, like my karmic debt, and that my suffering is now over. But I'm the one that has to cash it in and grab my joy, and that it was going to take a lot of work. Like, I'm not going to, I have the ticket in my hand, but unless I go to the show and give the person my ticket so I can go inside, like, nothing in my life's going to change. So the next morning, I called a friend, because I'd been in treatment 10 years ago and some seeds were planted, and I had them bring me to an AA meeting, a 12-step meeting. And that was January 2nd, 2011, and I have not had a drink or a recreational drug since then.
Wow. Amazing. Congratulations. That's a huge feat. That's amazing.
Yeah.
How does it make you feel even to just say that?
I still get choked up. I never won't. Mm-hmm. It was the most important decision and the most important day of my entire life. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life. And even above having my daughter, because if I wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have had her, or if I had, it would have been horrible for her to have an alcoholic mother.
So for someone who's out there who can identify with that terror of getting help, and for those out there who can't identify with that terror and they have someone in their life that is not seeking recovery yet, could you speak on the terror that you felt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it really gets down to the subconscious. I mean, our brain is designed to pre-record, like to record everything we've been doing ritualistically in our life up until this point, and it registers as that's what's keeping us alive. This is a big part of relapse too, because this is in the subconscious. So if I've been in my addiction for 17 years like I was, and all of a sudden I'm like, I'm done, like, I go into panic mode because my brain's registering that that's what's been keeping us alive and okay all this time, right? You think that you still think that there might be some fun in it, or you're still thinking that that's the only solution. You're still thinking that there's no other way to live and that there's nothing out there for you. But that is an illusion, because what addiction does is it puts you into complete isolation, and it's the addiction doing the thinking for you. You don't even have your mind anymore. Your addiction is telling you all of this stuff. So like when I went to my first meeting, it's like I was terrified because I knew it was my time to get sober, and that everything in my life was going to change, that I have no idea how it's going to happen, who's going to help me, how am I going to do it? How am I going to afford it? All the things, and I'll just go have another drink. No, but then I got to the meeting and I introduced myself as a newcomer, and I was just loved up, and I could hear my story and all of those people in the room. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't alone. I realized that I wasn't crazy. I realized that it wasn't my life. I realized that I had an illness, and it was called addiction, and there was something I could do about it. And that changed everything for me, that 1 hour, just understanding like what I was actually going through, that there were people there that understood, that there was millions of us that have gone through it. There's no shame in it. and that there's something I can sorry if I can cuss, but there's like something I can do about it. It's like, what? I can change this. And that's when you know you're ready, because you have to become willing to do whatever it takes. And the becoming willing part and getting over that fear, that's the hard work. Once you get past that and just surrender, like Shavasana in yoga, or when you lay down on your mat at ayahuasca circle and just let it wash over you, like that's where the miracle happens. And then the hard work's over. You just do the next thing.
So let's talk about 12 step and what 12 step gave you and where maybe it left off that led you then to go down a path of Ibogaine. It sounds like 12 step really saved your life, and that it's something you really still incorporate in your life today.
Yeah, no, my foundations will always be in 12 step. I owe my life to 12 step. And I joke a lot because now, obviously I've sat with the medicines and Ibogaine. I've been out in the jungles, and I've been to the Himalayas for my yoga, and all the things. But I always go back and say everything I really needed to know about life I learned in 12 step, kind of like that book about kindergarten, because it's true. And, what that gave me was, first of all, it gave me a path. It gave me a path out of suffering and into more peace, more joy, more connection. And so that's the point of all spiritual paths. So it was my first.
Did you go through withdrawal?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this, but at that point I had no resources. I was about ready to lose my home, and I didn't really understand what was available. So I didn't even go to treatment. I detoxed myself at home with cannabis oil. I'm in Humboldt County, and there's a big cannabis culture here. I was actually a cannabis farmer during the medical part for many years. So I was familiar with cannabis medicine, and I used that to detox myself. I probably should have gone to the hospital, but I didn't. And then, yeah, I was sweating it out in the meetings for some weeks and months, like just toughing it out. But guess what? For me, that's what I needed, because the first year I wanted to still drink, and the getting off alcohol was so hard that I was like, I never want to go through that again. And I don't want to stay there. So like, I can't drink, like, and that was the first thing that kept me sober. There's other ways to do that that aren't so, rugged, but that's the way I did it.
So what did 12 step teach you?
Yeah, so it got me on my first real spiritual path. It taught me about the importance of community. It taught me about the importance of having strong mentorship and how to find the right mentors. And I've used that skill I'll use that the rest of my life. I look for somebody who has what I want. And in that context, it was inner peace, stability, joy, and the ability to just function through life. I found a really good woman to help me with that. She became like my spiritual mother. I learned about being honest, radically honest with myself, with my, higher power, creator, and at least one other human being. I learned about continuously taking a personal inventory, cleaning up what's mine and letting what's not mine go, so that I don't accumulate things that cause anxiety, depression, shame, guilt, fear. I learned how to work through a process where I can heal myself spiritually. I learned about being of service, which doesn't mean necessarily making coffee at a meeting, which is where I started, and that helped a lot. But there's a bigger teaching. Every teaching expands, right? So like, being of service to me now means to show up in life looking at what I can give rather than what I can take, and then universe shows me what my next work is, and I could go on and on, but being honest. And, building self-esteem by doing esteemable actions. My sponsor would always say people in addiction are waiting for their ship to come out that they come in that they never sent out. And that seems to be the American plague right now. I just want all of it, and I really don't want to do the work. And that's carried into my plant medicine work, like so beautifully. And then I learned for myself for recovery is like, don't pick up a drug or drink no matter what, because I do have control over whether I take that first drink or that first drug, but I have an allergy, a physical allergy in my body that once it's in my body, the cravings take over and I don't have control over how much I drink or use. And so I learned that in there. So I got my power back. And there's a big myth. And I think that that's a big reason, like in Ibogaine and stuff, that people are like, oh, we don't like the 12 steps because it's like, you're powerless and all this stuff. I'm like, well, you didn't get past the first couple steps. That's the first half of the first step. It says I'm powerless over whatever. In my case, it was alcohol, comma, separately, and my life is unmanageable. So these two things are going on together. How do we fix this? Well, you get to the 10th step and guess what? It says we get our power back on one. And there's no promise. They always say there's promises in 12 step. It's not promises. They're directions. They say, if you do this instruction, then this will happen. So in the 10th step, it says we get our will back. We get our power back and we can use it freely on one condition, that we stay in fit spiritual condition. And then it goes into the 11th step, which says we need to cultivate our connection to whatever kind of higher power, universe, source, whatever we experience in the plant medicine, that thing, yoga, mat, the oneness, through prayer and meditation. We need to find teachers. So the plant medicine teachers have been part of my 12th step or my 11th step. So everything I needed to know about life and any spiritual path, and how to take my power back, how to take my will back.
What did that feel like, actually? I was just thinking, what did the 10th step feel like when you actually felt like you, in some way, were taking your power back?
Because the other part of the promise or the results from that step is that I can take or leave alcohol. It's neutral. And so I found by that point, and this is being that we've done a thorough job of not skipping anything up until this point, but it works every time, is that if I needed to bartend full time to support my daughter, which I wouldn't want to do, but I could. I'm not going to drink. Because I don't want it. I don't need it, because what I've done is I've effectively adjusted myself inside enough to not need to reach outside of myself for something to make me feel better. Because there's so many beautiful pearls in that text. I don't talk about the fellowship and all of the misinformation that can go on there. It's the book itself, but it says that no human power could solve our dilemma. And Bill Wilson, the founder, who is also a psychonaut, who went through psychedelic therapy before he created and during his tenure at his program of AA, he went to see Carl Jung, and Carl Jung told him back then that, the white light experience that we need to get on this path is outside of his scope, which means any psychology or psychiatric scope to do so,
So what led you to go from there to Ibogaine? At some point you decided to seek out plant allies. How did that come out? How did that come about?
Yeah, unexpectedly. So that was about 3 years into my recovery. I had dedicated my whole being to 12-step and extracted gold. I was active. I had sponsees. I taught 12-step workshop for 5 years every Monday to groups of people, all the things. I got really into yoga. I'd gone over to India because yoga helped me so much, because that's kind of what a diehard mission I was on to feel better, because I was so messed up, and nutrition and all this stuff, and everything was helping. But, I was in AA, and the promise there is that I'm going to be able to live a sober life. I'd gotten that. It says it's going to bring us out of a hopeless state of mind and body. I was out of a hopeless state of mind and body as far as my addiction goes. But for like many of us, I found other addictions coming up in my recovery. Back then, nobody was talking about trauma. Nobody was talking about chronic illness, all these things. And so I found myself like addicted to work, because I had a lot of fear around scarcity with my time on the streets and growing up with a single mother and all of these things. And then I had a child. We had a really traumatic medical emergency during our birth, and we were separated for 10 days after she was born, and like all these things happened. And so what happened was that I locked up again. I had extreme pain all over my body. I had, fibromyalgia. I had fatigue. I had skin rashes. I had weight gain, like 80 pounds. Like I would sleep for 10 hours and wake up exhausted and not be able to get going until noon. And I'm like, this is no way to live, you know? And my little girl was looking at me and I didn't feel good. She was 2. And, you know, I was really blessed. My sponsor was old school. She had been in recovery for 55 years back then, and she'd seen recovery before the big pharma came in the 80s. And then she, you know, her and many of the old timers would say that the relapse rates went up sky high. All of these things once the medications came in. And so she had been put in a psychiatric ward for 6 months during her detoxification process at 50 years old. And she saw from the inside out some of the horrible things that these pharmaceuticals can do to us and what they're doing to people like us when they institutionalize us. And so I was on antidepressants when I first got sober, and I do think that they saved my life, but they're only meant to be used for a short period of time, and they do not touch the root cause. Serotonin deficiency with the pill to replace is not going to work for most of us. It may manage, but you know what I saw was that the side effect of these medications, that, and this is what she taught me, that's not on the bottle, is that although it may quell some of the symptoms, you know, it's a spiritual, it's a trauma thing in the nervous system, and that medication essentially blocks us from getting down into doing the deep work. So she said, I have no judgment. I just know this well enough now, after all of these decades, that we are not going to be able to access the part of you that the spiritual medicine work that we're doing is needing to get down in. So if you want to work with me, you know, you're going to have to get off your antidepressants. So I did. But then fast forward, I wasn't feeling good again. The anxiety, the depression, everything was coming back. And now I look back and it was like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which almost, I would say everybody with addiction is medicating that to some degree. And as a last-ditch effort before going on psychiatric medications, I had seen a few friends of mine go down for Ibogaine and come back different people. So I chose to go down for Ibogaine treatment before I went to see my psychiatrist.
Wow. Okay, I want to just pull on a couple threads there. This kind of the pharmaceutical, as well as some of the diagnoses that people get when they do have an addiction issue. So how would someone know whether those diagnoses are real, whether this is just part of the behavioral aspects of addiction? It does seem like a wild cycle of medicines and then changing a medicine and then a diagnosis, and it all seems to be so wound up. What are your thoughts on that from your experience and what you've seen?
Yeah, well, what I've learned by going through the Western model, the traditional model, the Eastern model, the holistic model, all the models, is that every single one of them, including science and Western medicine, is a belief system. It's a belief system. And they're all true, but they're also partially true. And Western medical model was designed to save lives, and that's beautiful. It's got a place. When it comes to addiction, it's more of a spiritual condition. Traditionally speak, if you hear it in the 12-step, you can also go into the emerging field now and call it trauma, right? You know, so those meds can be life-saving. But you have to think about it. You have people coming into treatment like myself, and we're just fried on drugs and alcohol. You can't really accurately diagnose anybody for a mental health condition at that point because they're toxic, you know? And so what the treatment centers do and the psychiatrists are doing is just 8-minute visits and put you on an antidepressant. They don't screen you for root cause. They don't give you a trauma screening. They don't screen you for a low thyroid, your vitamin D and B12 levels, which are highly linked to depression. Everybody that's gone through addiction is going to be severely malnourished, not only because they're not taking care of themselves, but because of the state of their gut health, like I touched on here. And also if we're in stress response, our digestion just shuts down. We're not getting outside. We're not getting out in the sunlight, you know, so it's really easy to just smack a pill and the person's going to probably feel better for a while. But the problem that I have kind of dedicated my life's work to solve is that these doctors aren't giving what's their legal obligation is called informed consent. They do not tell people that all the side effects. They don't tell them that they are some of the most addictive substances on the planet, and most likely you'll never be able to get off. Even with opiate replacements, they're not telling people that they're almost impossible to get off of. And so you get down the road and then you're like, oh my gosh, and then those stop working too. So you have to kind of decide what's right for you. And it's going to be different at different times. When I first got sober, taking an antidepressant really helps, right? But then it didn't. But then if you subscribe to that belief system of Western medicine, because also there's no lab tests for mental health, they're all opinion diagnoses. So you have to be really careful who you go see and what their incentives are, what their intention and motivations. There's a lot of kickbacks on this kind of stuff. And then, you have to, in today's world, we really, especially for mental health and addiction recovery, we must become a CEO of our own health team. We have to advocate for ourselves and not give our authority outsource. Again, no human power can solve our dilemma. So like for me, I was like, I want more. I want more. But I was in a community of people that were constantly looking back to how bad we felt. Like I'd always be looking back to how I felt before. And I'm like, oh, I'm so grateful to just be feeling better. But I'm like, I don't feel good, And so then the holistic model's there. And that's been what's been serving humans for our entire history on this planet, besides the last 100 years. So you can think about that for a minute. And all of a sudden the mental health and addiction problems are so much on the rise. But in that belief system, humans actually have the ability to heal if the conditions are right. We can change our genetic expression, and it takes more work. But
I like that quote that you said the other day about sanity. What was that quote?
Yeah, that was another thing I was taught, because, it's like when you're in that state, you're just crazy, right? But then I was corrected because I was told that, when coming out of addiction, the good news is that you're not crazy. Because if you're crazy, you don't know it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do. And some people do have real mental health conditions. But in most of our cases, in mine, I was just insane. And I was like, well, that's not good news. I don't want to hear like, what? And they're like, no. Insane is just, unsound thinking. And you can come back to sound whole thinking. It just takes some work. So if you're insane, you can become sane again. And that was my first lesson in changing my perspective and opening up to possibility. And then guess what? I wasn't limiting myself anymore. So the possibility became my reality.
Oh, so powerful. It sounds like, so you went through this difficult process, obviously, like really, really incredibly challenging dark night of the soul with the alcohol, leaving home at 14, that alone, I can't even imagine, being on your own. And then AA and all the wisdom that you learned there. Now fast forward, you have a child and you begin kind of struggling again, not really feeling totally like this is where you want to be. And someone invites you, or you hear about Ibogaine. What was it like to choose to go do Ibogaine? What did that feel like when you were like, I need to do this?
Terrifying. Terrifying for a couple of reasons. Number one, and that's the problem I have with 12-step, is that, there's no mind-altering substances unless it's coming from a doctor who now are responsible for the opioid crisis. So it would have been okay for me to be on 6 psych meds and an opiate for my fibromyalgia. But I went to Ibogaine and I got ostracized because I was going to go do drugs because they don't understand. So, and that was scary because
so crazy, really crazy.
Because in that community, they tell you stay in the middle of the herd, basically meaning stay popular or you'll die. And
right,
so
that's
then,
become your tribe.
Yeah, so I don't like the group mentality in that way, and that's not in accordance with the teachings of the book at all. But anyway, so I kind of was like, I guess I'm leaving my community, especially as a woman who left home so young and depended on friend groups for survival. It was really a big deal for me. Secondly, what if it doesn't work? Then what does my life look like? I've run out of hope because I've done everything that they've told me to the 100th degree. Like I didn't just kind of try, I did it, and then
like this is the end of the rope, kind of. This is the last option.
And mental health issues, which I now know is trauma, runs in my family. So I was like, is this the direction I'm going? Gosh. And And then I was
And at the
also
time, what mental health issues did you feel like you had at that time?
well, see, I didn't feel like it was mental health. I knew it was in my body. I could feel it. Like I had pain and I had digestive issues. And yeah, I had brain fog and depression and anxiety. And I would still have anger outbursts, but only when I was like not being treated well. Like I ended up in leaving, I'm not with my daughter's father anymore, so I just would still have these like periods where I now know it's fight, flight, freeze, but I couldn't like get a control of myself. And so I was like, this isn't just a mental health thing where you take a pill. It's so much more than that. But what is it? And I was going everywhere and nobody had an answer because
So it's almost like the original traumas were being triggered, and then and your responses were anxiety, depression, brain fog. But at this time, physical pain. But at this time, you didn't have the language around trauma. So you had kind of fixed or worked on the addiction from one level, but then there was this other level to go into. I can imagine with a daughter who was 2 at the time, thinking that like this could be the last kind of hope of like a chance to change your physiology, where you've been in your life. Where did you go and how did that all turn out for you?
Yeah. And I was also afraid if done properly, the risk is very low, but it's the one plant medicine where there is a enlarged dose, like flood dose of Ibogaine, that there's a potential fatality risk. So I was literally risking my life to go down and do this.
And most people who are following the podcast know what Ibogaine is, but if someone is new here today, could you describe a little bit about what Ibogaine is, where it comes from, and even the tradition that it comes from and some of that?
So Ibogaine is an extract. It's not the whole plant medicine. It's an extract from the root bark of the iboga plant. Iboga grows in Gabon primarily, into Cameroon a little bit, I believe. But Gabon is where Ibogaine comes from, and that's a country in West Africa. It's been used traditionally by the Bwiti people. It's not a religion. It's just like a way of life. It's much like yoga, right? Like yoga is not a religion. It's just a path. And the Pygmy people. And the oral teachings have been handed down supposedly since the beginning of humanity. And they all believe, and I do too, after experiencing it many times now, that the iboga plant was what kind of helped humans become human and evolve into humans. And in Gabon, they believe that Gabon is the Garden of Eden because life came from West Africa, and that the iboga plant is a tree of knowledge, but they don't see it in a bad way. They see it in a very beautiful way. And so that's kind of the story behind where that medicine comes from. It's been used for everything over there forever, but initiation. And it wasn't until the late 70s that a young man named Howard Lotsoff discovered it. He was using it, I guess they extracted Ibogaine or something. I wasn't there, but he was struggling with an opiate addiction, took Ibogaine as a recreational substance and came out of it the next day without any withdrawals, without any cravings, and feeling the best he could possibly feel. And so from there, it started to become an underground thing. So Ibogaine is the extract. It's a lot stronger than the root bark. And when we use Ibogaine for addiction treatment, it's in a really large dose to be able to kind of cut through that really dense layer that we have to get through.
Flood dose. Also, just so I have had a couple interviews on this, I think Ibogaine was also used in the early 1900s in France in hospitals very often, but in our country, he was known as the one who kind of brought it to the recovery of addiction. So it's kind of interesting.
You're right. Thanks for correcting me. That's right. That is right.
So here you are. You're going to go take this medicine that even in the psychedelic realm of things, in earth medicine realms, this is a medicine that people brace themselves for. Some people feel like mushrooms, like, okay, this is accessible to me, and MDMA, oh, it's going to bring me love. But when you're stepping into the energetic field and power of Ibogaine and Iboga, did you have any idea of what the power of this experience was going to be like?
I thought I did, because back in my second wave days, we did some pretty heroic amounts of some things. And then I got in there and it was unlike anything I'd ever been through. It was definitely the most intense experience of my life. It was the most beautiful experience of my life and the most worthwhile journey I've ever taken. But
What
yeah,
was
I
it
think
like
the
to
first
leave
thing
your daughter behind?
um, it was really scary, but I also knew I needed to take that time. That was the first time as a mother I chose to reframe what motherhood is. I'm like, the only way I'm going to be a good mother to my daughters if I take care of myself. And I needed a break. I hadn't had a break in so many years. It was like I was exhausted of lifetimes of surviving. And I was like, you know what? I got down there and I'm like, this is me being a good mother right now. And people judge me. I can't believe you're leaving your two-year-old daughter at home. They don't understand. None of their business.
Mm-hmm. That's hard,
Best
though,
thing I've
because
ever
here
done
you
for
are
my
as a
daughter.
woman. Yeah, absolutely. Here you are, a woman, and as you mentioned before, there's a stigma around women who have alcohol problems or who have drug problems. There is as for men too, but there is different. And now here you are, a mother, and you're about to go take a psychoactive drug. It's amazing how our culture, and it's changing, but there is this judgment, and even more so, we talk about it a lot on this show, for mothers, like time to destigmatize, mothers taking their own path of healing and sovereignty and wholeness into their own hands. And as you said, like, you would have been prescribed, look at the opioid crisis you were talking about, like, that was Western medicine at its worst. There's so many beautiful things about Western medicine, but here you are, a mother just trying to figure out the best possible thing you can do to survive and to be a better mother.
Yeah.
And gosh, yeah, I want to bow to you in that moment, because going up against those cultural conditionings and pushback from those around you is really hard.
Yeah. But that was incredibly empowering, because that doesn't bother me anymore. What I would have done if I would have gone down the pharmaceutical route to be a good mother and just stay home is what I've been modeling her is horrible mental health, just surviving, no connection. You want to talk about passing on addiction. Me not drinking isn't stopping the cycle. It's like and then carrying all this trauma, because children regulate to us with the magnetic field of our heart, and they regulate to us. So if I would have gone down that path, I believe my daughter would have been at much higher risk for addiction herself. Now I'm modeling to her what's possible, what we do. I'm modeling her self-care. I'm modeling her self-prioritization. I'm modeling her all of the things. And I know that she's going to be having the tools to continue breaking the pattern in our family, because it takes 7 generations, so.
So take me on that plane with you. I think you went to Mexico, and take me on that plane with you through this journey.
Oh gosh, yeah. I was so afraid to go to Mexico, because back then I still watched the news and believed it, and so I thought Mexico was just all murderous cartels, and I was shaking in my britches getting off the plane, and then my people were like a half an hour late to pick me up, and I was so scared. And then they picked me up and we went to this little surf village, and it was so lovely and so laid back, and everybody was so nice, and it was so safe. There was no rush hour, there was no traffic. You just get up when you want to and go to the beach. And it
Was
was
it
like
Sausalito?
San Pancho is right north of there.
Oh, okay. Beautiful.
Yeah. And then I got to the clinic, which was like a home, and the people helping there felt like a big family. It was really simple. There was nothing fancy, and it was just what I needed. And they had this whole other outlook on addiction and recovery. There was so much more compassionate speech going on, and understanding, and not judgment. And, there's things being talked about like trauma, which I had not heard of before. Nobody had been talking about that, and
Nowhere in 12 step had they talked about trauma at all.
That's considered an outside issue.
Oh, wow.
And that's
seems like such an
now.
Inside issue.
It is an inside issue. It is.
Did your body just, when you entered that space, just like relax for the first time, or not yet? Was there?
I felt better, but I was, I look back now and I was essentially living in freeze response most of my life. And I was so exhausted. But then I got there and I kind of felt the warmth and the love from back in my earlier psychedelic years, because there's a special thing. And I felt that for the first time in 15 years. And that really reminded me why I was there. I already knew I was supposed to be there. My soul knew where I needed to go. And then we went on to take this was a flood dose. You can microdose with Iboga, do root bark ceremony. This was an Ibogaine flood dose I went for. So the way that these people work are really, really good. And a test dose, a smaller dose, is given a few days prior to the larger dose.
Was it taken orally or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a white powder in a capsule. And they also share a little bark just to tell the body what we're doing, bring the spirit in. And the test dose went through me beautifully. And then a couple of days later,
was there a ceremonial aspect?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. I didn't understand how lucky I was to be where I was at, but they were very well versed in the Western medical, because that's very important to have that there for a flood. But then they'd also been back to Gabon, gone through the initiation, practiced the rituals of Bwiti, and so we did have a ceremony. We went out into the woods, we put our intentions and our prayers, and there was a whole ceremony just before the test dose, and that opens the 2-week container. Mm-hmm. And then there was everything Bwiti was incorporated into everything alongside the Western approach, And there's a lot of technology in the Bwiti traditions, like those people call it, the jungle technology. It's not woo-woo. They've been doing this for millennia, and there's a very deep technology to what they do. With the sound, with the white powder and the red powder, there's medicine in all of it. When things are done, when they're not done, all of it matters.
Such a beautiful tradition. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That music is so unique.
Yeah. I was lucky where I went.
Music with the medicine, it's just so powerful.
Yeah, they all play the harp where I went, so that was really cool. Yeah, so the night where we did the flood dose, very intense, and I got a lot of visions. If you're going in for detox, I've been working with people integrating their Ibogaine experiences and preparing for them, and on site sometimes, for the last 8 years. And what I do see with detoxes is that you sometimes don't get as much visuals because it's working so hard on the detoxification process. But I had been clean and sober for some years at this point. And so when you get the Iboga vision, you're literally, your third eye just opens, and it's like this journey that you're going through. And it's like this movie, but it's like a river that you're moving through. And that's where the harps come in. They help you move through this river. That's what they're for. It's the technology with the sound there. But the first thing I saw was it gave me a life review, which is a very classic thing for Ibogaine to do, which is really interesting because that's exactly what 12 Steps first part is. And it had me kind of go back through my life, very similar when I worked through it in 12 Step, but it gave me a different angle with much more compassion, because in 12 Step, we're always looking for our part in it, which is important. But what can happen is that we become self-blaming and taking on responsibility for stuff that wasn't even ours. And it showed me, because of the environment that I've been raised in, because of my ancestral lineage and everything, that there's no wonder you ended up in addiction. Totally. And then look at how beautiful you are and how badly you were abusing yourself all these years. You forgot how amazing you are.
Yeah, it's always interesting, the letters of accountability sometimes, because I feel like the culture needs to write a letter of accountability to children. We come in these clean slates, and, you came in this pure clean slate, born into conditioning, a family with all the issues that it had. And I think it's so important to understand your part and take accountability. But it is interesting because how could you have been any other way?
Yeah. And then I got some compassion for myself. I was like, that wasn't all my fault. Oh my gosh. Like that was the normal outcome of what I'd been through. Like, I'm not broken. I wasn't born spiritually sick. I was born to a lineage of traumatized people, and I was like, my nervous system couldn't function properly because it was told to protect me because I was being born into an unsafe environment. Like, my mother was under a tremendous amount of stress from my father when she was pregnant with me. So her love told my genes that I was being born into an unsafe environment. So I was like born this way. So yeah, was I born that way? Yeah. But like, I'm not broken, and I don't have to be this way the rest of my life. Just managing.
Iboga and Ibogaine are known as ancestral medicines, and now our science has kind of caught up with epigenetics. Did Ibogaine show you anything about your ancestral lineage and trauma that ran through it?
It showed me on my Scandinavian side that my ancestors were warriors and soldiers and fighters since all the way back to the Viking. It showed that my ancestors were originally responsible at the beginning of colonization in Europe for a lot of trauma on other people. So there was karma there, but then there was also so much generational trauma in my family that like it showed my lineage, like mother child going all the way over the horizon as far as you could see. Same thing on my Irish side. It showed that I was raised that my Irish ancestors came over here simply because of the potato famine. They ran out of food. It showed me that, in fact, that was one of the worst genocides that's ever happened, and that my family came here fleeing from a centuries-long genocide. I mean, that changed everything for me. I was like, oh my gosh, because I always felt like I was carrying so much more than I could carry, or that I had the ability to even create in my own lifetime. And it showed me that that's exactly what was going on with me, and that I was tired because being the first person in both lineages to get into recovery and start doing this work, like that's a huge, like that's a warrior thing in and of itself, and what an auspicious, thing to be selected for. But it's a lot, you
It's a
know.
lot. And I don't think like if you are out there and you haven't done medicine yet and you don't have connections with some kind of indigenous voice, it's hard to understand. But, indigenous people feel like when we do this kind of work, we're healing our generations, 7 generations back, 7 generations forward. And if you're the first one in your family to go this path of deep earth medicine work, healing of the ancestral shadow and trauma, it's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's beautiful, but it can be everything, actually. It can be everything.
Yeah. That's a very good way to describe it.
So, how long was this experience?
The peak of it was like 8 hours, you know.
Was there any spiritual, mystical experience that you had similar to the MDMA experience?
Absolutely. So I got my life review. Then it had me walk through sheaths of terrifying fear, and it made me sit there and face it until I was not fearful anymore. And then it would let me pass, teaching me that fear is an illusion. And you get back to 12 step, it says that, the center of our addiction is self-centered fear, losing something we already have or not getting what we want. And that's trauma response. I'm afraid. So it made me go through that lesson, which was incredibly intense and very real. I had a gorilla like mouth on my face, it seemed, for 10 hours, and I had to stand there and take it. I could feel its hot breath and saliva like dripping down my face. And I had to just sit there until I wasn't afraid of it anymore. And then it would go away. And that was like these teachings. And then finally I came into this place of just pure beauty. I was like in the universe where the sound Om comes from, and there was the Buddha came, and my teacher in India came, and I was, they were bowing to me. And then I would bow to them, be like, no, why are you bowing to me? That's ridiculous. And then I would bow to them and they would disappear, but they were so beautiful to look at, especially after going through all of that darkness that I didn't want. I'm like, no, please come back. So the only way they come back is if I sat up straight and let them bow to me. And that was a lesson in my own divinity, and that all of us are here because we're supposed to be. I deserve to be here just because I am. And that all of us have God inside of us, just like AA teaches, just like Yogananda, or God's in our spine, medicine, whatever, And then I got to see the bija. So in the chakras, in the yogic system, the little dots in the middle of each mandala for each chakra is the bija sound seed. Everything comes from sound in the yogic philosophy. And so it showed the bijas dropping into the space with the mandalas, like dropping out, just to spreading out into this universal consciousness space, like the quantum field. And it just let me feel what it felt like viscerally to be that connected to that. And that has served me for, ever since. That's been like one of my greatest teachings, is to identify what these complex teachings are talking about, because it's very simple when you know how it feels.
Back to the body, right? When we can feel that in the body, such a gift from earth medicines, bringing that into the body sensation, the embodiment of that, you can probably at some time, many times, bring that into your life experience. What was so powerful about Ibogaine? You had these visions, as many earth medicines bring us in multiple different ways. What was the most powerful part of Ibogaine as far as your transformation in your life?
How I felt afterwards. There's a recovery time after Ibogaine. The next day can be pretty rough. But then I slept. And then usually after you sleep and then you wake up, that's when you feel the difference. And for me, I was blessed with I got what everybody's hoping to get for when they go for Ibogaine. And what I found after I came out of it, I realized that it was the first time in my life that I actually felt good in my own body. No pain, no fatigue. My gut was like brand new, no gut pain, no stomach pains, no fatigue. My skin rashes, everything had cleared up, and my eyes were crystal clear. My dark circles were gone. I had no depression, no anxiety. I had perfect mental clarity and neutrality, like they explain of, years on your mat with yoga or something like that. I had it all there. And then my first remembrance when I came out of it, like the next after I'd slept, was that I had done a slideshow in my mind of photographs of different family members, past partners, these kinds of things, that would have sparked a charge previously. It was completely just unconditional love, compassion, forgiveness, and release. And I didn't have a charge anymore with any of them. And, but most markedly, what I realized was that my hunch had been, before I went for Ibogaine, before I went to the psychiatric model, that so much of it was in my body. And that validated that after my Ibogaine experience, my mental health was better, but what felt the best was my whole body. It's like I got a new body. And that clenching of stress response, now we know it's trauma, like that just clenching that causes toxin builds up. It causes immune system to stop working. It causes the gut to become unwell. All of it, like it just released. And then like my body was able to heal in one day. And
so profound. It's so wild. Like it's just the craziest thing that all the years, generations before, somehow you have this first experience of your life as your body being in full equilibrium, balance, probably mind, body, and soul.
Yeah, it was completely balanced. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what normal people feel like. And then I realized that, I had been selling myself short, always looking back and saying, well, at least I don't feel like when I was at my worst with my addiction. I'm like, well, that's not really setting the bar very high, And I was like, I was right to follow my heart and not let my community tell me what is okay for me and what's not. And for society to tell me what's okay and what's not as being a mother. I just did the right thing, and it was the thing that everybody was telling me I shouldn't do. And that was the thing that's worked best
Amazing,
for me
huh?
out of everything I've done in my life.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think that one of the things that, comes out of working with these plant allies is this sense of a deeper knowing within you what your path is, a sense of sovereignty and truth.
Exactly. I want to talk about getting your power back. Or remembering that you had it the whole time. It's more of a
The whole time.
remembrance. I never lost anything. Forgot. Nobody taught
Yeah,
us.
as we do. Coming home now with this new wisdom, this new deep understanding that you have within you, this deep knowing of what choices to make in your life, what power that is, as you said. What was it like to come home from Mexico and this experience to your daughter?
Oh, I'll never forget coming home. I wasn't ready to come home until the day I was scheduled to leave, which was 15 days. I needed all of those days. But when I came home, I got my daughter, and I understood how children feel because I was so raw in a good way. Like I was so clear and so cleansed. It felt literally like my heart was on the outside of my chest, and I could feel the breeze like going over. I was having to wrap myself up in like a shawl for about a month after because I was so sensitive. But that's the gift of Ibogaine, is it gives us back our ability to feel because we've been numbing for so long, and all of a sudden I can feel everything, and I'm so sensitive, and I can feel what's good and I can feel what's not good, but it's my choice to decide to take in or let go. But with my daughter, it's like I could connect my heart field with hers, and there was joy and there was deep connection because she had been taken away from me at birth because they thought she had a medical condition. It's a long story, but we had the trauma of being separated for the first 10 days of her life. And that was like it shattered our connection, and it was like we got connected again. It was like magical. And then I noticed in my daughter, because she'd also been dysregulated, she had tantrums and meltdowns and all this stuff, and I was like, I didn't understand, but now I do. She was regulating to me and I was dysregulated. So now I came home and I was regulated, and so now she had a mother who was regulated, so I could teach her nervous system through my energetic field how to regulate. And so it's like that could have taken years of counseling with a kid and never gotten anywhere. It happened the minute I came home from my medicine because I was different. So she was different too. And our relationship has been amazing ever since.
Oh, I want to meet her.
Yeah.
I bet she's adorable.
She's
Oh, that's so amazing. So you learned a lot in this process, not only about yourself, but you also learned a lot about the Ibogaine industry and what's still needed, where it's lacking, the real strengths of it, how to prepare for Ibogaine treatment, and also the aftercare. So I'm wondering if you just touch a little bit on what you feel like it's missing. And I'd love to have you come back because I know that this is your work.
Yeah.
You really help people get ready for this. So I'd love to invite you back to talking to our audience about how they could prepare, but also some of the issues really not necessarily being addressed within the Ibogaine clinic world.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I was lucky that I'd been a little bit down my path at that time. So I already knew some of the things that need to be done for recovery, no matter what modalities or path you're choosing. There's foundational things that must be in place. And then I also knew that, after Ibogaine, that it turns into another substance called noribogaine that stays in your body for, some weeks to months, depending on different things. That can kind of help keep with that inner correction that medicine can provide, because it can really reset you to pre-addictive state. So I knew that was a window, but I also knew that I wasn't just going to get to take something. I just get to stay that way the rest of my life. I knew that by now at that point in my journey. And so I was like, I'm going to use this feeling that I have as in my North Star, because I know it's possible for me now. And now I need to go home and find the lifestyle practices, the nutrition, all the things that's going to help me keep my body in this condition, because I know if I go home and I'm living on coffee and cigarettes and junk food and I'm staying up all night, like I'm not going to stay feeling like this, and I want to stay like this. And so there's so much afterwards, and there's good support going on in Ibogaine afterwards sometimes, but we're really missing the physical piece. And if we've also been traumatized, which Ibogaine is really great for trauma-related conditions, that it can clear our stress response, it can regulate our nervous system, but it doesn't mean that we are going to lose the tendency to be triggered. It doesn't mean we're going to lose the wiring that we may be sensitive people. And so how do I learn to regulate my nervous system and build resiliency so that the exterior of this crazy world we live in doesn't affect me so much? Ibogaine doesn't take care of that part. So that's this opportunity to feel good enough to go on and start doing all the things that are continuing to make us feel better, right? Body, mind, and soul. We're really leaving out the body piece though, a lot in this.
Right.
And the clinics are missing the point. A lot of the clinics are doing 7-day treatments and just sending people home. And although that may be what's available to you, it's really important to know that you are not going to overcome an addiction in 7 days. It's absurd. What you can do in 7 days is be detoxified.
Right.
And then the real work begins when you get home.
Yeah. So let's end there, actually, and have the next episode with you be where the real work begins, and let you really kind of dive into what your process was in coming home, what you learned, and now how you support others.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's such a joy to be here. I really appreciate the work that you're doing in the world, and it's so nice to be around other psychedelic moms.
Yes, it is. It's amazing. I'm going to put all your information in the show notes, and so that if anybody wants to reach out, and we will come out with part 2 very soon. So stay tuned.